This week's topic is colorants. By now we all know that the perceived color of an object depends on the combination of the spectral power distribution of the light source, the spectral reflection or transmittance of an object on which the light falls, spectral sensitivities of the eye, and finally the brain's interpretation of these and other responses in the observer's field of view. In other words, our model for seeing color, where we have our light source, object, and observer. This particular chapter in the book, this chapter deals with only one of the factors of that threefold nature of the production of what we call color. We'll be dealing with how the object interacts with light. We now consider that the light source and observer are constant. We'll examine those substances used to modify the spectral reflectance or transmittance of an object, the colorants that we use to color plastics. So first we'll talk about chromatic colorants. Chromatic colorants are characterized as having selective absorption and scattering of light. That is, these quantities vary with the wavelength of the light, so that they selectively modify the spectral power distribution of the light falling on them. So in other words, there's white light that falls on the object. Some of the wavelengths of that light are absorbed. Some of those wavelengths are scattered. They're not done uniformly across, so that we end up with chromatic colors. Here's a slide that goes back to the beginning of class when we showed the electromagnetic spectrum and discussed how visible light is just a small portion of that electromagnetic spectrum, and that our eye is sensitive to wavelengths of light between 400 and 700 nanometers. Anything less than 400 nanometers is ultraviolet region of the spectrum we don't see, and anything greater than 700 nanometers is the infrared region that we also cannot see. Achromatic colorants, as opposed to chromatic colorants, are spectrally non-selective absorbers. They're black and grays, or they can be spectrally non-selective scatterers, which are whites. So if we were to look at the spectral curve from these particular colorants, we would see that they go basically straight across. The height of the line that goes straight across on our graph determines whether it's a white, which would be all the way or near the top, black all the way on the bottom, and grays would be in between the two extremes, the white and the black. There's also special effect colorants that the color effects are caused by the diffraction of light. In addition to our regular color effects, we have additional color effects, and some examples of special effect colorants in nature are feathers or iridescence of certain insects. When we look at them, we don't see what we would consider a normal color, but a kind of special effect color. In industry, we can have special effects by using pearlescent colors, metallic colors, or even fluorescent colors that have extra optical effects in addition to just reflecting back certain wavelengths of light. A definition of a colorant is any substance that imparts visible color to a material or mixture. Colorants are either pigments or dyes and may be either. What that means is, in some applications, a particular colorant may be a pigment, and in another application it may be a dye. And we'll discuss a little bit later how that can be. There's three possible situations of where a colorant is present. It can be naturally present in the material. It means we don't put it there, it's there right when the material is made. It is added or mixed mechanically into the material, and that's what we do when we are dealing with adding colorants to our plastics. Or they could be present in the solution in the material, which means they dissolve in the material. Chromophore is the chemical substance within the molecule that makes a material a colorant. It's a chemical grouping which, when present in a compound, gives color to the compound by causing a displacement of or appearance of absorbent bands in the visual spectrum. Kind of the chemical definition of how it produces colors of a certain color. There are several types of colorants. There's pigments and dyes. We can divide pigments into organic or inorganic pigments, and then dyes are another category. They both selectively absorb specific wavelengths of light and either reflect or transmit other wavelengths. Types of pigments: organic and inorganic pigments, and dyes, with the main difference between the two of them, solubility in the medium the colorant is used in. So pigments are not soluble, they stay as particles, they keep their crystalline structure, and dyes are soluble, which means they dissolve into the medium. A particular colorant can be a pigment in some materials and dyes in others because of its solubility. It's possible for a colorant to be soluble in one plastic but not soluble in another plastic. It does depend on the plastic that the material is used in. We can separate colorants into different classes. We can have typical color pigments, where the optical effect is the result of selective absorption and scattering of light. Some examples of typical color pigments are carbon black and phthalocyanine blue. And then we can have special effect pigments, which in addition to typical optical effects, additional appearance effects are present. Examples of those are metallic pigments, pearlescent, and fluorescent pigments. The definition of a pigment is a colored black, white, or fluorescent particulate, organic or inorganic solid, which is usually insoluble in and essentially physically and chemically unaffected by the vehicle or substrate into which it is incorporated. So when we put a pigment into a plastic, it stays as a particulate. So if we had a microscope and could look down into the plastic, we could get down small enough, we would actually see pigment particles. They can be organic or inorganic. They retain their crystalline structure. And also, they do not react with the resin. That's important. When we put colorants into plastics, we're actually performing a type of chemistry that's the chemistry of non-reaction. In other words, we do not want any chemical reaction to take place. If that happens, then the pigment is altered and our color is altered. Pigment will alter appearance by selectively absorbing and or scattering light. And again, the pigment will retain its own unique crystalline or particulate structure throughout the incorporation process. And that's very important for pigment properties, not only its color, but properties like light fastness and heat stability, chemical resistance, and so forth, that it depends on its crystalline structure. So when we deal with pigments, dispersion is very critical. Pigments have to be optimally dispersed throughout the plastic. If we don't have good dispersion, we can cause problems like reduced color strength. The colorant is not as strong as it could be. Reduced transparency if the color is a transparent color, it gets cloudy. Reduced opacity if the colorant is normally opaque, it will be less opaque if you do not have adequate dispersion. Poor dispersion will cause variation within lots and between lots. We will not have consistent color within the batches of color that we make. Poor dispersion can reduce the physical properties of the plastic. Normally, the bigger the particles, whatever they are, that we put into a plastic, the more it reduces its strength. And dispersion breaks down the pigment particles. The bigger the particles of pigment are, the worse the physical properties are normally. If it's a really poor dispersion, we can actually see dark specks in the product. So dispersion includes several aspects to it. The first thing is reducing the particle size. And when we do that, we break up the agglomerants into smaller sizes. The smaller the particle size, or the larger the surface area, the stronger the pigment. And we mentioned that way back in the beginning of the course. Color is a result of light reflecting off the surface of the pigment particle. The smaller that particle is for a given weight, the more surface area there is, and the more reflection takes place. So once we break down those pigment particles, we don't want them to reagglomerate. So what we do is coat the surface of the pigment particle with a dispersion aid, usually a wax-type material, that coating helps keep them separated as we go through further processing. Finally, completely incorporating the pigment particles into the substrate, which means completely wetting out the particles. Particles are in contact with the plastic all the way around. There's no air gaps in between the two of them. Those cause problems with how light reflects off of the particles. So we want complete wetting of the pigment particles to have complete incorporation of the pigments into the substrate. A couple definitions when we are talking about pigment particles. First is an aggregate. An aggregate is a very tightly bound pigment particle that cannot be separated by typical dispersion processes. So when we talk about pigment particles, the very smallest particle you can have we call the primary particle. And then what happens is, as we process them, as the pigment supplier makes them, they tend to want to stick together and clump up. When they clump up, they can be tightly bound, which is what an aggregate is. And when this happens, they're usually so tightly bound that we can't break them apart with our typical dispersion processes, or they can be agglomerates. Agglomerates are relatively loosely held particles that can be separated by typical dispersion processes. When we perform dispersion on our pigment, we're really breaking up the agglomerates. The aggregates usually are too tightly bound to be able to break them apart. Pigment suppliers try to reduce the amount of aggregates and agglomerates in the pigment that they sell, but they always produce some, and that's where the compounders come in to perform the dispersion of the pigments into the plastic. Now, a couple terms that in industry are oftentimes mistakenly used interchangeably are distributive mixing and dispersion. They're really two different things. They're often confused and used interchangeably. They do refer to two different things. Distributive mixing is the uniform distribution of the particles throughout the substrate. So we are taking our particles and spreading them out through the whole plastic part uniformly, so that if we look at any particular portion of that plastic part, the concentration of the particles would be the same. Dispersion, on the other hand, is what we talked about, reducing the particle size, coating the surface of the pigment particle, and incorporating the pigment particles into the substrate. We need both dispersion to get the particles reduced and distributive mixing to get them uniformly distributed throughout our substrate. Here's a little picture that shows or tries to explain the differences in what we want when we have good distributive mixing and dispersion. We start on the very bottom left-hand side. We have poor dispersion and poor distributive mixing. We have poor dispersion because we have pigment particles that are stuck together into larger particles. We have poor distributive mixing because those particles are not uniformly spread out through that bottom left-hand box. If we move up straight above from that box to the top left box, we see that we have good distributive mixing, where we have the pigment particles uniformly spread out through the box, but the problem is we still have poor dispersion because we still have the large pigment particles where the smaller particles are stuck together. If we move over to the bottom right-hand box, we see that we have complete dispersion, where we have all of the larger particles broke down into the smaller individual primary pigment particles. So we have complete dispersion, but they are not uniformly spread out through the box, so we still have poor distributive mixing. Finally, the top right-hand side box, we have complete dispersion, where all the particles are broken apart, and good distributive mixing, where they are spread out uniformly throughout the box. So that's what we're after when we're coloring plastics, is to have complete dispersion and good distributive mixing, so we have uniform color throughout our part and batch, and we also have the most complete use of all the pigments coloring ability by having the smallest particles. That's the ideal. Another picture that shows steps in the dispersion process, and we have here on the left hand side two different types of pigment: an easily wetted pigment on the left, which is in a good wetting resin, and then on the right side there it's a difficult wetting pigment in a poor wetting resin. So kind of the best possible situation and the worst possible situation. So we start with the easily wetting pigment. We see that we start wetting it, the polymer gets in between the pigment particles easily, and then we start mixing it up and they separate, and we still have good wetting. It starts breaking down into more smaller particles, and finally grinding, we break into the individual particles where they're all separate. On the other hand, when we have a difficult wetting pigment, we have in the beginning there wetting, we have trouble getting the polymer in between those pigment particles, so that makes the mixing not as complete, and there's bigger particles that are stuck together, and then even after grinding we still have some of the pigment particles stuck together, so we don't get very good dispersion. And then finally over on the right hand side there, that picture shows ideal dispersion, where the pigment particles are completely wetted out and completely separated from each other. So pigments stay as discrete particles when they are incorporated into a resin to color that particular resin. The physical aspects of those pigment particles affect how the color is perceived. So those particular aspects that are important are the average particle size. When we talk about a large number of particles that we have in our pigment, they're not all the same size. We can measure the particle size several different ways, and one of them is the average particle size. So we add them all up and divide by how many they are and find the average particle size, just like we find the average of anything else. But also we can find the particle size distribution. Not all the particles will be the same size, so we have a certain distribution of sizes throughout that particular set of color and particles. We can describe those particles, we can describe that batch of pigment using statistics, and the average and the distribution are two important statistics that are used. Also, a physical aspect that's important is the shape of the pigment particle, whether it's round or square, platelet, those sort of things. And the shape, and part of the shape is the aspect ratio, and that's the relative size of one side of the particle towards the adjacent side of the particle. Another important physical aspect is its refractive index, how fast light passes through it, and then any kind of chemical coating that the pigment suppliers put on the surface of the pigment particle. That can change its chemical reactivity, how well it or how easily it is dispersed, and many other physical properties. Particle size is important because it affects scattering. Very small particles scatter little light. The particles get so small they're actually smaller than the wavelength of light, and the light just goes right past them. Scattering increases with increasing particle size until the particles are as large as the wavelength of light. Then as we get larger, then the scattering power decreases. And we can look at that relationship in the following graph. Here we see on the graph that that dotted line that goes up to the highest point on the graph shows where the greatest scattering power of this particular pigment is, and that refers to a particular diameter. If we start from that dotted line and go towards the left, we have our particle diameter getting smaller, less than a wavelength of light, and you can see that its scattering power drops off pretty quickly. If we start at the dotted line and go to the right, we see that the scattering power drops off as the particle gets bigger. One thing that's important with real pigments is that we're generally on that right side of that dotted line. We hardly ever get such a good dispersion that we break down the particles smaller than what we see there. Most pigment particles are on the right side. Generally what we say is the more we can break down the size of the particle, the better the scattering. And that's what we're doing. If you notice, it depends on the particle, but the more energy you put into the system for dispersion, the better scattering power that you get. The question is, how much energy and cost do you want to put into the system to increase scattering? And you have to kind of have a trade-off between those two, because the more dispersion you do, the more time it takes, and also the more cost it incurs. You have to kind of look at it on a cost-benefit type of analysis. Generally speaking, the smaller the particle size, the better the scattering and the stronger the colorant. Okay, here's a graph that shows particle size, and if we look at the L-shaped curve in the middle, we see where the optimum wavelength is. If we go towards the right, we see how much scattering we have. And then on the dotted line, we look at the tint strength. And the smaller the particle, the greater the tint strength. If we look at where those two curves cross, we have the optimum particle size for the best balance of strength and opacity. We can draw graphs for individual pigments that show this, so we can look at the optimum scattering of a particular colorant. And that's the sort of thing the pigment suppliers would do, not so much the compounders, or certainly not the process. One thing about particle size that's important for matching colors is that as the particle size change, the undertone of the color changes. So if you remember when we talked about colors and the main color and the undertone, what we're talking about is that, say if we have a red, when we think of our LAB plot, a red can either have a yellow undertone or a blue undertone. So the two colors on the plot that are adjacent to that particular color. For instance, a blue would have either a red undertone or a green undertone. When we're talking about color changes here, we're talking about the difference in the undertone. When we have a red, if we make the particle size smaller, it will change to be yellower, or the undertone will be yellower. If we change it to a larger particle size, it will become redder. Greens, on the other hand, if we increase the particle size, they get bluer, and if we decrease it, they get yellower. Yellows, if we increase the particle size, they get redder, and if we decrease it, it gets greener. And then blues work the same way. We get redder with larger particle size and greener with smaller particle size. And whites and blacks even change with particle size. Whites become bluer with smaller particle size, whiter, brighter white. They become dull when they get larger particle sizes. And then blacks become redder when the particle size gets smaller, and more of a gray or bluer tint when the particle size gets larger. The particle size not only affects how strong the color is, but also its hue. So it's very important that it's controlled as precisely as possible so that those values do not change. And here's another way of looking at the shift in the undertone versus particle size in more of a single diagram. But when the particle size gets larger, the undertone shade goes towards the counterclockwise direction. When the particle size gets smaller, the undertones go in a clockwise direction and shows the different colors along the circle there. So it gives you an idea how the colors change with changes in particle size. Particle size distribution is also important for the color of a pigment. If you've had a quality control class or a statistics class, you've dealt with the distribution of individual measurements in a system. Here we have several different kinds of distributions. The first one that is the highest on our graph there is called a narrow distribution, and you see it has our average in the middle. This type of distribution is that there's not much difference in the values away from the average, so it doesn't spread out very much. It's kind of straight up and down. We compare that to the broad distribution. We see that it has the same average distribution, but the values are more spread out. There's more values that are towards the smallest end of the scale and towards the largest end of the scale. So there's more variation in the particle size in that particular kind of distribution. And then finally we have a bimodal distribution where we have two peaks where there's two sets of particle sizes basically that were made. We have one where the average is on this part of the curve and then another average on this part of the curve. So there's almost like if we had two different average particle size lots and we mixed them together, this is the kind of curve that we might get from that. What's important for color matchers to realize is that in all three cases here, the average particle size is the same, but the distribution is different. And if we looked at, say, chips made from with pigments from all three of these distributions, what we would probably see is that all three of the chips that represented all three of these distributions would look different. They would not all be exactly the same color. That can affect color also. Not only particle size, but particle size distribution. So particles can come in different shapes. If we look at this slide here, we see at the top are the different types of primary pigment particles. So those are the individual pigment particles. And we can see that they could be a square shape, they could be a circular or spherical shape, they could be a needle-like shape, or they could be some sort of odd shape. You can see what they would look like individually. Then we go in the middle section of this curve and see what the aggregates would look like. These are the tightly bound particles, and we see that there's a lot of area of contact in all of these particular aggregate structure. The cubes, we have complete lining up of them, so there's a lot of surface area in contact. Same with the needles. And what happens there is, since there's so much contact, it takes a lot of energy to break them apart, usually more energy than we can put into the system. Agglomerates, on the other hand, they're stuck together, but there's not as much surface area of contact, so we have the ability to break them apart because it doesn't take as much energy to break those particular types of clumped up molecules or clumped up particles apart. This slide shows particle shape aspect ratios. We can look at a sphere or a cube. Our aspect ratio there is about 1, which means that if you looked on one side or measured the area on one side of the particle and then measured the area on an adjacent side, it would be approximately the same. As we move towards the right on this slide, we see that the aspect ratio gets larger, with the plate and especially the flake and the needle being pretty large, which means that there's a big difference between, for instance, the flake, the top side of the flake and the side of the flake. Different amounts of area. That can affect the way that the pigment particles stick together. The definition of an aspect ratio is the ratio of the longest length of a particle to the thickness of that particle. So you can see that there's quite a range when we talk about pigment particles. Another physical property that is important with pigments is the refractive index. And the refractive index is defined as the speed of light in a vacuum, or in our case in air, divided by the speed of light in the material. If you look at this example here, the speed of light in air is 300,000 kilometers per second, and the speed of light in this particular plastic is 200 kilometers per second. So we can divide the 300 kilometers by 200,000 kilometers, and we get a reactive index of 1.5. The speed of light in this particular material is less than the speed of light in air, and the difference between them, the index, is 1.5. Also, at every boundary where there is a change in the refractive index, we have this sort of situation where some of the light is reflected off of the surface and not affected by the material. And if you remember back near the beginning of the class, we talked about something called specular reflectance. This is where that specular reflectance comes from. That reflected light is the reflection of the light source and is not affected by the color of the particular object. And then the light is transmitted through our material. It's transmitted at a different speed. You see that the line that represents the beam of light coming in changes its angle. We can see that in kind of normal everyday life. If we take a straight stick and put it into a pond or a pool and we look at it under the water, it looks like it's bent. This is what causes that stick to look bent. The light is being transmitted at a different speed, but looks like the stick gets bent at a very specific angle based on the refractive index. The important thing for colorants, pigments, when we look at refractive index is the difference between the refractive index of the colorant and the refractive index of the particular medium it's coloring. If the particles in the medium have the same refractive index, there's very little scattering and the light just passes right through it. If we have particles in the medium have different refractive indexes, then there's lots of scattering and we get more coloring power. This graph shows that a little bit better. If we have our medium and pigment with identical refractive indexes, we see that we have zero scattering. The farther apart they are, and it really doesn't matter which direction it goes, which one is the higher refractive index, we see that the greater the difference, the larger the scattering and the more coloring strength we have for that particular material. We can sum that up by saying that pigments are most efficient as light scatterers when their refractive index is quite different from that of the resin from which it is used, and the particle diameter is about the same size as a wavelength of light. That gives us the most optimum physical properties for light scattering strength of pigment.